So 2 weeks ago, we talked about agency and automation and learned that maybe there's a way of thinking about agency beyond something that we individually possess. Instead, we started to look at agency as something that exists in the relations and affordances between us and objects and things in our environment. And today, I'm excited to have my friend and colleague Darren Kong introduce how we can connect this type of thinking with the ecology, how we can bootstrap culture and agency in connection with the land, with technology, and bringing a whole lot of perspectives in. Darren is a product manager and a cultural theorist, as well as a permaculturalist. He's active with New York-based permaculture research and action group Biosphere X, and he's also my colleague at Other Internet. So we are going to do. Darren's gonna do a talk, and then we're gonna transition into just a group discussion session. And Darren will come down from this screen onto a chair, and we'll all, sit around and we can talk. And we'll probably go right into that afterwards. So cool. And there's gonna be another. I should mention that there will be 2 more events as part of this series. The next one will be a reading group on July 30th. That's another Tuesday. We do no homework reading groups here at Trust, so there will be no homework required for this reading group. We will actually read at the reading group, so feel free to come. Please come, please. All right, so excited to hand it over to you, Darren.
Awesome. Thanks, Toby. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Check. Awesome. Thanks for the kind introduction, Toby. Thanks to Arthur, thanks to Callum, thanks to Lewis and the Trust team for having me, and you all for listening. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm excited for this talk. So I'm going to set my timer and we'll get into it. All right. So in many ways, I feel like we're situated in a time where we're fraught with existential issues. This is a talk premised on an alternative to both existentialism and accelerationism. This is a talk premised on ways towards a sort of praxis. It doesn't reject dystopian premises per se, yet it doesn't accept utopian premises either. It frames a positivist perspective on where we are and how to think about some of the largest problems we face. The burden of late-stage capitalism around us is oppressive. All around, we see that we're constantly nudged to nihilism and irony. Climate change is a close but interrelated issue. Climate anxiety is rampant. Anger is palpable. I've never been to a climate grief support group, but I honestly do get it. In many ways, these problems seem insurmountable. I've heard people suggest that successfully addressing climate change means needing to mobilize as we would for World War III. Climate change and the cascading effects of late-stage capitalism are gray swans, or also known as gray rhinos. If black swans are the unknown outlier events, gray rhinos, gray swans, we all know they're there, but we're unable to address them. A gray rhino is a highly probable, high-impact yet neglected threat. Gray rhinos are not random surprises, but occur after a series of warnings and visible evidence. One example I think is important to keep an eye on with regards to gray rhinos is cost disease. Cost disease poses the question, if productivity is in fact increasing, why is it that cost of living continues to increase without the accompanying increases in quality adjusted life years, better test scores, or cheaper, more effective housing? Just as our healthcare system struggles to manage chronic conditions like diabetes, our society's governance structures don't seem to be able to substantially address many of these gray swans. When there are so many looming problems without appropriate responses, we get something very familiar to many of the folks in the blockchain and adjacent spaces: fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There's a breakdown of the promise of the social contract because we see all these lights at the end of the tunnel, and these lights are in fact fires. they're smoking and suffocating us. Problems that parliamentary procedure or checks and balances can't address. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt is telling at cracks in the social contract. The modern social contract theory centers around how humans relate to the state of nature. Humans give up their freedoms in exchange for social coordination. It's an interesting premise that emphasizes the brutal natural state of humans and this choice humans make for civility. It's this choice that Hobbes and Locke suggests humans make to justify absolute sovereign monarchy. The social contract of the Western liberal democracy facilitates what Fukuyama posits is/was the end of history. Others might call this the liberal hegemony. The liberal hegemony is indicative of Fukuyama's flawed but influential thesis in his book. Fukuyama himself doesn't necessarily think the end of history is a good thing. He suggests that we're in for an age of boredom, quote unquote, no more ideological conflict. But really, the modern global social contract is certainly not an ideological equilibrium, as one sees with the rise of China as the next global superpower and the fracture of Western culture. It's really a nuclear equilibrium. Nuclear weapons stockpiled from the US and Russia can effectively destroy many, many countries many times over. Yet we see that while this nuclear logic still remains potent, this kind of equilibrium can't address effectively the issues of modern society, nor really solve any of the relational issues. The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler was a famous and highly influential book. Spengler is a cultural relativist, yet a cultural determinist. E.g., history makes the man does not make history. There's undoubtedly a lot left to be desired from his grand mega theory of history, but there's a lot that's interesting about his proposition of a typology of megacultures and superorganisms, how they develop, how they fail. This talk is about bootstrapping these so-called cultures. Spengler makes a fundamental distinction between culture and civilization. He sees civilization as the logical end result of culture, a culture that ossified and disintegrates. Spengler would suggest that what we're seeing today is the full transition from Western culture to that of a civilization. It's reflective of the West's dramatic fracturing and breakdown. But there isn't so much an end of history as there are suggestions we're at the late stage of a cycle that can't be maintained by nuclear weapons alone, a cycle that can't address mounting problems purely with growth. We need new cultures. We need new superorganisms. That being said, there are silver linings. Anxiety. People are angry, they're anxious. There's a reaction. A reaction is a feeling. A feeling is human. Feeling is power. Climate change. There can continue to be denial, but we're seeing the fallout, and it will be addressed push come to shove. This is a picture in the background from the ongoing drought in Chennai. Innovative technology. So solar and renewables continue to drop in price, electric vehicles, bioplastics, genetic engineering. There are a suite of potential solutions. They're not there yet, but potentially there's progress that could be made. Population degrowth. Growth is slowing. There's a lot of reasons why. But some of the instability caused by climate change will be contained or at least bias a longer time horizon due to population degrowth. But how do we get to be in this position of the sixth extinction to begin with? In an essay, Flight from Nature, John Michael Greer, who blogs now at Ecosophia and formerly was the blogger at the Arch-Druid Report, suggests that there are these 5 reasons, which I've roughly summarized, for why climate activism has failed to save us. 1, call-out culture. 2, inability to empathize and address climate denial. 3, lack of leading by example. 4, relationship between carbon footprint and status games. 5, the human disconnect from nature. The first 2 of Greer's points, call-out culture and lack of empathy, are captured in this quote. A lot of sustainability movements want individuals to be responsible. And while individuals are not irresponsible per se, we have to understand that any solution needs to build a culture. These include small and large practices that directly address their population, their needs, their wants. And those cultures need to uphold the same question posed in the social contract. What is the relationship between human and nature? Most modern cultures dramatically fail this litmus test. Greer illustrates the human disconnect with nature poignantly via the suburban cockroach. I'm sure most of us in this room have been in this predicament, just as he describes. The suburban or urban cockroach degrades us. We feel demeaned, inhuman. Yet at the same time, here we are, both just existing. This instinct belies this very tricky territory of what is human versus nature. Lucas Winklerprin in his newsletter makes this very insightful remark about how legibility affects how we conceive and interact with nature. Our legibility conflates and constructs these hard to discern boundaries between human-made versus natural. As Lucas points out in this first line, differentiating human-made and natural landscapes is a fairly fruitless effort. But nature and human have always had some form of symbiotic relationship. What is natural? What is man-made? Much of our relating with nature is subconscious, for we ourselves are truly entangled in this reflexive loop between perceiving and being part of nature. Within this framework, we can also understand the spirituality of nature to be something that is experienced and understood through the human vehicle. Deep ecology in this conception is a spiritual understanding of ourselves as part of nature. It is our understanding of ourselves within that tree. It isn't to say that we are anthropomorphizing per se, but rather an acknowledgement of our embeddedness within our perception. It is the idea of crafting God within our own image. One way of interpreting climate anxiety and anger in this context is that of a disappointment in ourselves. I've since lost the source of this diagram, but it captures the diversity of emotions that we face with regards to climate. And that's a good thing. It's good that we care. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. Being Ecological by Timothy Morton, like Fukuyama's End of History, is another Hegel-influenced book, but focused on the implication of living ecologically from a phenomenological standpoint. Understanding the implications of living ecological data, he describes the experience of navigating the world in terms of ecological data as the PTSD dream. Ecological data factoids that don't really connect to our personal relationship with ecology, but seem truthy. But what are we responding to anyways? Just as Morton, I'm deeply suspicious of the kind of ecological data that he writes extensively about. The kind of accuracy we get of weather data should be telling. Climate models are just that, models. All statistical models are ultimately founded on estimations, not truths. And while simulation and exploratory analyses can be helpful tools for action, I find it incredibly unlikely for government action predicated on policy responding to such models to be satisfactory. No doubt, of government action can and must help, but in my opinion, it's improbable that policy silver bullets exist. It's too complex of a system to reduce into a series of numbers that can be responded to by broad-based policies. And let's be frank, the wherewithal and the nimbleness isn't there. I find the expectations of top-down mandates to be deeply suspicious. Back to the World War III analogy, how can we compare climate change to World War when there's an infinitely complex system and we don't know how to measure the score? This quote is from Aaron Brown, my favorite author on risk management. He reiterates the point here. Not only can we not trust our models for predictiveness, we can't tell which way they are wrong. For example, Malthus was famously wrong about the resource trap, but every high modernist engineered solution digs a larger and larger hole. That being said, don't lose hope. Back of the napkin calculations still suggest that it's possible to extract significant amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. This is a visualization from ETH Zurich of possibility of tree cover globally. Again, not particularly helpful as a policy suggestion, but it is helpful as an exploratory idea. And the point of the distinction between human versus non-human, what is there to lose hope about? What are we actually worried about? This is a photo from a series by Jonathan Giminet. This one depicts an abandoned greenhouse in Belgium where nature takes hold. This is a picture of Chernobyl, which since the 1986 nuclear disaster has become a ghost city, but also now a lush forest, teeming with vegetation and wildlife. Even in the most radioactive areas, vegetation has returned within 3 years. Some scientists have commented that Chernobyl has de facto become one of the largest nature preserves in Europe. There is no one way to skin the cat. Rather than top-down planning, we need bottom-up innovation. And honestly, we need many efforts concurrently. So where do we start if we want to cultivate utopia? I suggest to start from the beginning and realize we're deeply entrenched in dominant cultures. It's a gradual process and a multifaceted problem. I'll begin by listing some of my assumptions on what it means to create new cultures. In our disenfranchised age, people are craving culture more than ever. Where there's perhaps a broken social contract with our government and society at large, people seek a new contract to fill the vacuum. While society continues to trend secular, there's growth among younger cohorts, especially for more traditional sects of religion. Consumers fanatically support product and media brands, and it seems like every few weeks you hear about someone starting a cult. Culture addresses the life cycle of our species. It provides context for our place in the world. It forms a sort of solution to ego death. This is an often neglected part of the social contract, but one that I feel is deeply important. A culture needs to improve the fitness of its participants. If it isn't providing an evolutionary advantage to its adherents, then it's not likely to sustain itself. If its population dies off before it can propagate, a culture provides space for iterated cooperation. A culture preserves iterative cooperation into its cultural memory. It moves the model from individual learning to group learning. This is incredibly important in today's economy because knowledge capital and knowledge work is the main driver of value creation. Wenger describes this shift in his book, A World After Capital. A culture should and needs to create a platform for cooperating, discovering, and preserving knowledge. In this way, a culture can become powerful. Finally, although Wenger is right in that from a management perspective, knowledge work is shaping the modern world, and scarcity has shifted away from resources to our attention, outside of the aggregate on the grounds, resources are still highly unevenly distributed. A culture needs to reclaim that distribution for its population, and in that way reclaim ecological symbiosis, as material provisions are derived from ecological symbiosis. In this way, a culture can quite literally participate in the livelihood of its constituents. Ironically, without material provisions, a culture cannot be certain of benefiting from a world after capital. This is the largest gap I perceive within community organizing today. A culture must provision an economy of abundance. And again, fundamentally, this is a question of ecological awareness. Taking those preceding cultural assumptions, how do we translate that to a permanent culture? Surely there are many long answers to this, but an elegant way to posit is, what is the least most requirement a culture can achieve that would lead it to become a permanent culture? The fundamental implication of a permanent culture is its temporality. And more meaningfully, the difficulty of temporality is that the social strata of our species changes remarkably quickly. An intergenerational culture is one that can adapt and flourish in substantially different conditions. An intergenerational culture is powerful. An intergenerational culture has birth, it has death, it has education, it has succession. An intergenerational culture will, over time, become a permanent culture. But intergenerational longevity certainly is a non-trivial challenge. Let's posit further. What other attributes must be developed by an intergenerational culture? Minimum viable population is the threshold needed for a species to maintain before extinction becomes inevitable. On a long-term basis, a permanent culture needs to exceed or meet the lower bound of this population count. Furthermore, the rate of replacement needs to equal or exceed loss. So births equals death, but also migration equals immigration. We need to be able to introduce new populations, importantly migrants. A permanent culture needs to provision for itself and its cultural commons. A permanent culture must be able to transmit knowledge between generations. A permanent culture must be adaptable. It has to allow its adherents to engage both actively and passively. It needs to understand that this engagement will shift over time. Finally, there needs to be resilience. If a nuclear family household is a single generation, implying a short-term culture, intergenerational family households, by definition, are multi-generational and facilitate a longer-term culture. Using this definition, the easiest way to satisfy a permanent culture, or the start of one, is an intergenerational family. Intriguingly, it's common in Eastern culture to practice ancestor worship. From this context, we can also hypothesize that the decline of intergenerational households with the rise of modernity may coincide with a decline in long-term cultures. What this means from a cultural standpoint is each of these social units still has to maintain a social contract. And that's why it's so difficult to run a well-functioning nuclear family. An incredible burden is put on the shoulders of the nuclear unit, what traditionally was supported by many cultural forms, explicit and implicit. Where larger scale multi-generational families are diminishing, the struggle of an aspiring permanent culture is to provide new social scaffolding that can create both intimacy and space for healthy coordination. Taking all this into account, the Practitioner's Guide to Permanent Cultures has 6 pillars to its framework. Ecological awareness is a foundational metaphysics, which includes humans as part of that awareness. This awareness forms the foundation of culture and is something that is hard to reclaim once lost. Through 2 and 3, we build 4, the experiments of minimum viable superorganisms. And finally, 5 and 6 are mature expressions of our permanent culture. While this isn't a roadmap, as strategist Simon Wardley would say, we need a map to play the terrain. The Practitioner's Guide to Permanent Cultures is a framework for understanding the foundations. And today, our incomplete Utopia toolkit includes 2 primary frameworks: the permaculture design system, as well as the lean startup theory of innovation. So I'll first speak on ecological awareness, or the lack of. John Michael Greer calls this the pervasive ecological illiteracy of our society. In these 2 quotes, Morton describes how ecological awareness traumatizes us, or rather the lack of awareness. He sketches ecological awareness downstream effects as a catalyst for World War II. It takes a minute to seep in, and I recommend reading his book and John Michael Greer for more, but a culture that is not ecologically aware becomes unhealthy. Robin Francis, an early permaculturist, leaves us with this thoughtful quote: "The truth is, it is the industrialization of our culture that have disturbed our ecological relationship, and thus our ecological awareness. And any new culture must be premised in making that relationship deeply whole." And as it should be, there's a reason why nature is healing. For nature teaches us something about ourselves, because it is us. We are a part of nature. Permaculture is one of the tools we have in introducing ideas of ecological awareness. Here, Bill Mollison famously is quoted saying, "We can teach philosophy by teaching gardening, but we cannot teach gardening by teaching philosophy." Morton here describes ecological awareness as a tuning of humans to non-humans. What's striking about this quote from Morton is that ecological awareness and its network logic also applies to technology. To be anti-technology is to ignore our current ecology. And per Lucas's passage earlier, it's hard to even determine what is human-made versus not. In some ways, I suspect it is a theory of mind issue. We are always in a state of flux, yet in a state of equilibrium. Ecological awareness will help us be aware of this relationship. In the Breaking Smart newsletter titled Politically Opinionated Platform, Venkat Rao discusses this relationship between our Dunbar roots, yet the human participation in large social networks. The interaction between human and computer is also an interaction between human to human. It suggests that we have to accept our fundamental sociality. Furthermore, accepting that we, each of us, is already a cyborg. While humans came from Dunbar number communities, humans ultimately crave social scalability, and there is no one sociality framework that will work. Furthermore, we aren't online anymore, really. Is there really a distinction? Beyond sociality, in practical terms, ecological awareness, from a cultural sense, will include an understanding of material needs and how we relate to the larger dominant culture. Illich gets at the root of how it is in this day and age in this excerpt. We can use Twitter to craft clever jokes and shitposts, yet our culture doesn't autonomously provision for our basic material needs. What we're talking about is not technology per se, but power and how politics are embedded into technology. The same critiques can be made by social and economic technologies. It's not that we're categorically against these aspects. Corporations succeed because they're filling in a void. But this void filling is not truly building a culture. Our culture needs to learn from corporate successes as opportunities to rediscover what our culture has lost and research what our culture needs. Importantly, this is also suggests a possibility of startups building a culture on a long-term timescale. But it operates within a vastly different logic than the business environment we currently work in. A sustainable culture is one which is able to more or less provide value along Maslow's hierarchy. The longest running cultures are the ones that have the most adaptability. We've outsourced much of our culture to capitalism, which lets it scale well, but also in the end loses out on a lot of richness. Importantly, it's unlikely there will ever truly be a universal culture. Aaron Lewis here gets at why culture is important. Although it's focused on the higher tier needs, I argue the physical survival needs are equally important, as the divorce of that foundation is what is desensitizing ecological awareness. I found this second Maslow hierarchy iteration the other day. Haven't had much of a time to ruminate on it, but it crosses many of the attributes we are discussing today. So now a moment on permaculture. Permaculture and a suite of other frameworks are some of our tools for rebuilding non-monetary autonomous capacity. Its originators have outlined 12 design principles shown here. 7 layers of an ecosystem from canopy to root layer, and 5 zones of a human environment. Various permaculture practitioners have managed to impressively restore all sorts of biomes using a thoughtful practice of observation and design. Here's an illustration of the 5 zones of a human environment. Zone 0 is the house. Zone 1 is closest to the house, systems that need to be frequently attended, such as herbs or berries. Each further zone will be designed in accordance to most frequently visited, closest to home, to least frequently visited, farthest from home. Zone 5 is typically thought of as unmanaged wilderness. The 12 principles, 7 layers, and 5 zones may sound lofty, but in practical terms, the easiest way I can describe permaculture is as a system for applying a pattern language, but for ecosystems. Permaculture is a system of design which takes cues from observing ecosystems and modulating them. Permaculture, in fact, is very complementary to a pattern language. Permaculture stands in juxtaposition to annual agricultural systems, in that it attempts to build systems that take minimal inputs. For example, perennial plants are highly favored over annual crops. Resource and water management are heavily considered and designed into the system. Here are 2 photos of a Biosphere X permaculture project, 5 acres in upstate New York. On the right-hand side, one can see a swale. A swale is a hollowed basin. A day after a rain, it's caught water that would have run down the slope were it not in place. Trees have been planted right outside the berm of soil, the mound of soil adjacent to the swale, and will benefit from the access to water. Note, Biosphere X has been fairly successful implementing permaculture design ideas into a suburban context with limited space. David Holmgren, one of permaculture's co-founders, has recently written a book called Retro Suburbia, which focuses on this aspect of permaculture in suburbs. Whoops. Here's a group photo of a field trip / retreat to Oasis, the Biosphere X project mentioned before. Alan Savory, shown here, isn't strictly permaculture, but he would likely be bucketed within regenerative agriculture. He wrote an influential book called Holistic Land Management. Reading it, I was quite surprised at how sophisticated it was as a business book. Most Silicon Valley startups don't seem to care about unit economics, but when you're doing regenerative agriculture, you really have to be concerned. Financing is limited and every input matters. Savory's system uses rotational grazing of large ruminants, like cattle, to reverse desertification and promote grasslands. This rotational grazing pattern can be thought of as mimicking the former pattern of wild roaming bison herds. Through grazing, physical impact, excrement, ruminants can be moved through a land in rotation to revitalize its grasses and soils. Here's a photo of me participating in Community Grassland Monitoring Day with at Grassland Greenwood. She's a grazer formerly in Sonoma, but now grazing much larger scale of her partner across New Mexico and Montana. Through grassland monitoring days like this one, we can substantially see the changes in grasses and the diversity of grasses just from grazing in quick iteration. Regenerative agriculture, this larger umbrella that permaculture sits within or adjacent to, often takes a more production-centric perspective on agriculture. It integrates a lot of ideas from permaculture, rotational grazing, and holistic land management from Alan Savory, agroforestry. This is a screen cap from Biosphere X drone footage earlier this year at the Valley Park Agroecology Center right outside Tulsa. You can see the swales here in a much larger scale than the Oasis project. These swales are meant to direct water across a significantly large piece of land. Other practitioners focused on regenerative agriculture include Mark Shepard, who has a school of thought called restoration agriculture. Also in the blockchain space, the guys and gals from the Regen Network have run a regenerative agriculture consultancy for many years. It's important to note that permaculture and its neighboring disciplines and schools of thought are rapidly incorporating new ideas, and themselves are not necessarily anti-technology either. Here's a recent example of how technology and ecological practices can be combined that's gotten some buzz: agrivoltaics. While cloud providers like Google are trying to go green, it's unclear how effective carbon credits are. There are more direct measures technology companies can take to incorporate ecological design patterns into their work. So that being said, permaculture gives us tools. How do we get there? By developing culture. So where is permaculture failing us? Or where is permaculture not a culture? And why is it not going to lead us to a permanent culture? First, education is expensive. If attending a permaculture design course costs around $3,000 plus or minus travel expenses, this obviously severely limits access. There's a lack of ability to accumulate resources via permaculture. Many of the more well-known practitioners, such as the ones I've listed, make a living through education. But even active mode is tough. It's a lot of work and very difficult to sustain yourself living off the land. The populations that need permaculture the most are often the ones with the least resources to pay for education. Limited opportunities to practice outside of owning land. It's hard to think of what a passive mode for permaculture is at this moment. It's not really thought of in the culture currently. The material perspective of permaculture. There's a distance from spirituality in the permaculture movement as it is today. The genesis of permaculture was such that it was developed in a time where it wanted to be distanced from woo. There's also been recently a shift of the permaculture meta narrative into one of land management. This is associated with cultural appropriation, being practiced, taught, and evangelized by affluent white male landowners, well-meaning landowners, mind you, correlates to a lack of hubris around permaculture being an umbrella for many existing indigenous practices. Just as the back to the land movements of the 70s and the normal practices of keeping gardens and chickens and goats will die off, So too will permaculture, given that it doesn't inherently have a basis for replication. A really great exploration of this was the blog post, Permaculture of the Landless, by a permaculturist professional who has been struggling to make a career. I recently realized that this domain is down, unfortunately, so I'll have to mirror copy, but I encourage everyone interested in permaculture to read these two essays, as they are heartfelt. I'd like to highlight two groups that have more primitivist roots than most of permaculture. Rewild Portland is a Portland-based nonprofit. It has a Foundations in Rewilding course that it recently completed its first year for. I personally believe it's really groundbreaking work. Rewild Portland is family friendly. It's non-elite. They honor the indigenous traditions that they help spread. Although mostly secular, they don't shy away from spirituality necessarily. And it's much more closer to a primitivist mindset with one foot still in traditional society. Feral Culture is a primitivist group that practices a subsistence hunter-gatherer lifestyle in the bushes of Alaska. They don't cultivate any crops. They solely live off the land. Alaska is one of the few places left where the abundance of wildlife makes this possible. I believe there are 2 people out there right now at the Feral Culture node, although several people have gone to visit and several people have neighboring properties. They have a web forum, but it's also down now. It's hard to update websites when you're in the bushes of Alaska. While I have tremendous respect for the work of Feral Culture and other subsistence rewilders, I don't believe that we can turn back. To make lasting change, addressing intergenerational or even foundational species issues, we need to build permanent cultures which are able to exist at scales reaching thousands of years. To be able to have this kind of lasting longevity and a minimum viable population, a permanent culture cannot live in isolation. It must have a coexistence with the mother culture while maintaining its own distinct form. In a nuclear equilibrium world, cultures without nuclear capabilities need to have political influence such that there's game theoretic equilibrium. To allow a culture to survive, unfortunately, we see this disequilibrium distinctly in the struggles of First Nations and indigenous populations that have had continued encroachment on their human rights and native lands. This permanent culture and mother culture coexistence is difficult to reconcile ideologically. There's this innate rejection of the wrongness and lack of justice prevailing in our current system, which is driving much of the desire for these new cultures to begin with. A true permanent culture will need to have this kind of mimetic resilience, though. Through opting in to this coexistence, we have a more intensive selection pressure on its cultural propagation. For new possibilities, and most importantly, to access the knowledge capital latent in our age, we must look towards history, look towards the fringe, look back at the self. We need to start from scratch to start permanent cultures. Say that your praxis is to eat the rich. Suspend disbelief for a moment and take the satire seriously. Anyone that's watched a heist movie knows that it takes a team. What kind of team would you assemble? Now, don't at me, but I hold that Fast and the Furious is the best movie franchise of all time. I wish I could play clips from this video for you, but for sake of bandwidth, we're stuck with a screen cap. The Fate of the Furious 8 from 2017 shows the best teamwork in the history, HD. They perform risky maneuvers. They take their destiny into their own hands. They're a motley crew, but they got each other's backs. Roles and specialization where each member is able to contribute while maintaining individual agency, and most importantly, exhibiting good teamwork. There's also at least 8 movies according to this video, so one could say it's intergenerational of sorts. Here's another example of teamwork for analysis in the real world. Just like the movies, startups as a model organism are fraught with oftenly disturbingly cheesy antics. Yet startups themselves are also privy to the same logic in order to become permanent cultures. They need to understand that their products need to or should increase evolutionary fitness of their users as well as their stakeholders, their employees, their managers, their investors. And on the flip side, aspiring cultures have a lot to learn about what makes Silicon Valley successfully tick. Silicon Valley has a very powerful ideology. We see the worship for Naval Ravikant, the Jack Dorseys. We see the mind-altering substances of choice, microdosing, austerity, fasting, intermittent fasting, keto. That's the start of a permanent culture. While a startup itself may not be intergenerational, capital is passed through generationally. And there exists a venture cycle to feed into new startups or bigger companies, acqui-hires. This suggests that Silicon Valley as a superorganism may be on its way to becoming a permanent culture. That being said, it does need to grapple with certain challenges to do so. Local ecological dissonance seems to be at an all-time high. There's burnout, mental health issues, lack of breaks. Increasingly, even early staff don't make out well in exits due to the large funding cycles. All of these problems, I believe, are potentially surmountable as a culture, but time will tell. In this quote from Naval Ravikant on the right, Naval suggests that over the long term, while there are betrayals for high stakes, he argues Silicon Valley allows one to determine who they can work with. Anecdotally, I think this is true. As much as we can eye roll Naval, I think this is helpful understanding of permanent cultures, per the prisoner's dilemma Venn diagram earlier in the presentation. Cooperating strategies are the only type that can be always robust. Silicon Valley, for as much as its flaws, has some basis of long-term cooperation that seems to work. And we often make fun of startup bros for eating the same thing, wearing the same thing, reading the same books, listening to the same gurus, tweeting the same shit, honestly. But we also think that we ourselves are special and unique. We are, but unfortunately, that can be deleterious for teamwork. The truth is, homogeneity, even the Silicon Valley kind, can be very helpful in facilitating teamwork. Here's Adolfo Cambiosa. He's thought to be the world's best polo player. He's posing here with his 6 championship horses. What is noteworthy is that all 6 horses were clones of the same mare. They're named Quartetera 1 through 6. Cambiosa rides them exclusively in competition. Notably, his rivals are traditionalists, but have not beat him in several years since employing this strategy. The next cultural case study I'd like to look at is the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Their reputation precedes them surely, but a simple question I'd like to pose. Would we be hearing as much about the Black Panther Party were it not for their social infrastructure, such as their free school lunch programs? I honestly don't know enough to answer that, but I can tell that they were in it for the long haul. They developed more than 60 Serve the People programs, including efforts to provide free clothing and shoes, medical services, drug and alcohol awareness, legal aid, and they are thought to have the first true early childhood education programs in the nation, preceding Head Start. Finally, I'd like to consider brands as culture. In the recent Letterman interview with Kanye, Yeezy mentions his ambition to be the Hermes of sportswear. Hermes itself was established in 1837 in France, starting off as an intergenerational family business. Toby's done a lot of work on comparing how brands and cults have analogous logic, so I won't deign to reiterate. But it'll be interesting to see if brands can cross over to become cultures as we are defining it here today. Most brands operate within a consumer perspective, taking resources in exchange for entry in status games, rather than one of accumulating autonomous productivity for its customers. Yet, there are certainly fashion houses that have longevity across various designers. I believe that it's possible to break out. Lot 2046 is one to look out for in this regards. Their ambition is admirable. The few times I've watched their live stream, the impression I got was going to space camp for Europeans' creative directors. In all honesty, I think that's a great thing. A quote from Lot's founder: "There's no founder, no equity, no board of directors, no future," the designer said. "No creative director, no advertising campaign, no maniacal profit drive. It's important to have this ego death." I personally wonder if it's possible for Lot to move beyond designers. That will be a turning point in whether it can be an intergenerational brand. Then it will remain to be seen whether Lot can support its customer base to develop agency. All right, so where do we start in cultivating teamwork and group agency? Crucially, how do we build cultures that shift the orientation from the self to the communal, turning self-care into communal care, individual practices into group practices? My belief is that this communal orientation can be co-developed with ecological awareness, as it is a form of it. Gall's law is that complex systems start from simple systems. The most well-defined framework I know for creating simple systems is the lean startup. Most systems and projects fail due to complexity. If we don't scope achievable goals, we will never succeed. Anecdotally, and in my experience, many organizations have strong ideologies, values, and long-term goals, but lack short and medium-term objectives and strong process. The lean startup remedies this by providing a tool set to help us develop teamwork and culture towards a reasonably scoped goal we've defined in our framework for permanent cultures. Lean startup is a really familiar idea that can be hard to internalize. It's following an agile approach to iterating on a product experiment until you find product market fit, aka something people will buy. The idea is to use the smallest amount of work to build that can be used to test assumptions. In my experience, there's a lot of different levels of comfort with what is the minimum viable blank. The truth is that fewer resources you have, the more creative one has to be with how to approach the assumption of what is minimum viability. Many of the methods evangelized by Lean Startup are commonplace today. Build, measure, learn is the loop we briefly discussed in the previous slide. Minimum viable product is the smallest build experiment we can run to test our assumptions. A/B testing is a user split testing across cohorts as an experimental technique. Actionable versus vanity metrics. Pivots. When an experiment fails, we invalidate our assumptions and we start a new experiment after proposing new hypotheses. In sum, the lean startup suggests doing the minimum at all times until we achieve product market fit, at which point there is a natural growth that achieves latent market demand. The funny thing about the lean startup is most of the hot Silicon Valley startups today don't really abide by it. The logic in the Valley now is of what does it take to get funding? Sometimes no MVP is necessary at all, as a lot of early stage investing is pattern recognition around teams. Lean startup is a local maximizing strategy that reduces waste iteratively. The new Silicon Valley startup blitzscales their way to unicorn status by spending aggressively. That being said, most of us that are interested in creating cultures don't have that luxury. So, in Peter Thiel speak, how do you go from 0 to 1? For us, how do we start a permanent culture? We form teams of like-minded individuals. We try a lot of things. We document, we learn, we make decisions. We scope down to the minimum viable experiment such that we can reject our experiment without the cost of running it to be too painful. What's all the more confusing this day and age, though, is no matter how experimental we want to be, we likely have to do this while keeping one foot in our mainstream economy in order to pay the bills. Again, our permanent culture has to live on its own distinctly, yet coexist with the dominant culture. A first orientation that may be helpful in inhabiting a mindset which allows us to approach climate change as a tractable problem is one that Morton illustrates here, this notion of playful care and playful seriousness, which I thought captured the idea well. A genuine play that explores, a play that allows us to take action. It is through this mindset of play that we can look at serious problems, but with the mindset of the infinite game. Recognizing play allows us to fluidly break out of finite games. In Homo Ludens, Huizinga identifies 5 characteristics that play must have. By applying some of these ideas, we can use play to break new boundaries and create new possibilities. Which makes sense for a long-term project over thousands of years. It has to be fun for it to be sustainable. Yet we also have to engage with important issues. Interestingly, there's a parallel aphorism in Silicon Valley around play. Chris Dixon from A16Z has this to say about toy technologies. The next big thing starts out as a weekend project. But Dixon, I believe here, is correct. What separates the toys from the next big thing is process. Play and toys in and of themselves are not sufficient for any real change. But play is a starting point for teamwork. The first lean startup experiment of a permanent culture is one of coordination. How do we relate to each other? How do we communicate? How can logistics work within our group? Here's a Biosphere X game night where we're playing the cooperative game Hanabi. Hanabi teaches all those capacities in a very lightweight form. I see many of the workshop exercises people run in the speculative design art community serve a similar purpose, building a space to test coordination. But I see a lot of creative domains as fruitful areas: comedy, improvisation, fashion, cosplay, music, cooking. There are infinite possibilities to test our coordination. That many sports derive themselves from war games is suggestive of their strong capacity to develop teamwork and communication. This is a photo of one of a series of mobility workshops Biosphere X ran at Prime Produce. Shout out Prime Produce. It's pretty self-explanatory. Work out together, go to the gym with friends regularly, surf, run, play sports. Bodily autonomy experiments are crucial as they are some of the most actionable areas we have to improve health within our culture, while simultaneously strongly inducing teamwork. They are a worthwhile experiment for any permanent culture. Food. The first step with food is to experiment with diet with friends and ladder up the value chain. Experimenting with food is either the hardest or the easiest, as there's so much emotion packed into food. But food is also the building blocks of culture. Soylent, veganism, paleo, carnivorism, as some of the Bitcoin people have taken to recently, keto, 1 meal a day, OMAD, intermittent fasting, fasting, if it fits your macros, bodybuilding, wake up at 3 a.m. to pound chicken breasts, eating seasonally, do it all. Crawl up the supply chain. Contact farmers for direct sourcing. Hunt, grow your own food, process your own food. If you're a Soylent customer, it's pretty trivial to make a 6-month supply of DIY Soylent yourself. Play around with the politics of provisioning. As much as I enjoy reading theory as the next person, in my experience, diet is the entry point for practicing ecological awareness. Food is a universal language. I'm honestly not sure if anyone else has this experience, but perhaps you'll get to where I have, where when I walk into a grocery store, my mind is consistently blown. For those that have lived in co-op houses before, group meals are probably old hat, but for those that don't live nearby each other, it can still be fruitful. Here's an example of a weekly Biosphere X meal prep. Meal prep is often thought of as a singular activity on Sundays, but in fact, it's more fun when it's with people. Quite literally, meal prep with a group helps a culture intertwine their lives together. I have typically attempted to eat paleo for a lot of my adult life, but because of BX meal prep, I began eating quite a few of my meals vegan, and it was enjoyable. As you move from experimenting with diet up the food supply chain, consider the capacity to grow food as often a function of reclaiming land. As land is often one of the most constrained resources, we have to think creatively. I'll review 2 personal case studies in hopes of providing a practical framework for what it means to reclaim land. This first project starts in 2012 from a quest to reclaim vacant land for green space and food production. This photo in the bottom right is from a local Brooklyn news outlet in 2013. I would often spend hours every weekend walking around the neighborhoods, consulting city maps, which were luckily cleaned and visualized by advocacy nonprofit 596 Acres, now called Living Lots. And you can see the screenshot in this deck here. And looking at the city maps to see who owned which vacant land. A small but growing group of community organizers, we would canvass the local community, get signatures, go to community board meetings, and generally communicate our enthusiasm for activating vacant land. One of our members would call while at work to the various public agencies that own these lots to give us temporary leases. It was a long and arduous process. And while we were optimistically working on trying to get access to a beautiful NYPD owned lot that hadn't been touched in 10 to 20 years, after much pain, we were eventually told it was earmarked for a parking lot, although it was right next to a mostly vacant parking lot itself. Despite that, with much continued effort and the advocacy support of 596 Acres, another year later of organizing, we did get access to a lot owned by a different agency, HPD. You can see its general status here in the left today. Sorry, you can see its general status here in the left before we started. It had been unused with historical use as an illegal dump site. Today, on the right, a thriving community garden featured prominently on Google Maps. From 2015, a year into operating, we've built out several garden beds. There's lots of heavy metals in the soil, so beds are necessary for food production. We have a sacred lodge built by local artist Kurt Stegler. We housed a local composting business. We hosted the Radical Gardeners, who have a lot of cool projects like a free seed library, and perform a number of very interesting activities like guerrilla fruit tree grafting on city trees throughout the neighborhood. Here's from the back. We attached this hose to a fire hydrant. At the time, we had to jerry-rig this hose to a hydrant across the street, since the pipes connecting to a hydrant nearby would actually cause flooding in a neighbor's house. So we learned that the hard way. Water is life. It really makes you appreciate permaculture techniques once you've had to go through provisioning water through a hacked way such as this. The community garden now doesn't rely purely on a fire hydrant. We have a water catchment system attached to a shed roof, which will supplement our water supply with several barrels of rain upon precipitation. So that was El Garden, a project from Evergreen Lots. I understand that there's Princesson Garden. Many years ago, I met some folks from there that visited New York. I believe it's actually near Trust, so give it a visit sometime. It's a fairly ambitious project, it seems like. This was a beekeeping operation on a rooftop of an industrial warehouse in Queens. Urban agriculture, for the most part, isn't really scalable. But green roofs do actually have some helpful properties. Green roofs provide temperature insulation, which can be actually a substantial cost saving for a large building such as a warehouse. And 2, they prevent rainwater overflow, which is problematic in combined sewer systems. I'm not sure if this is how the sewage system works in Berlin, but in New York, sewers are designed to collect rainwater runoff, domestic sewage, and industrial wastewater in the same pipe. Most of the time, combined sewer systems transport all of their wastewater to a sewage treatment plant where it is treated and then discharged to a water body. So, in times of abundant rain, these three different types of runoff can commingle, and thus pollution from domestic sewage and industrial wastewater can go into our water streams. By having a green roof, we can collect more rainwater, acting as an increased buffer for this problem. Here's the start of our setup of this beekeeping operation. Through one of the tenants in the space, a commercial distillery, we negotiated with the landlord of a leasing agreement. We rented a fence for safety, bought a prefabricated hive. We picked up our bees at Columbus Circle in the spring. We had put in our order with a breeder in the winter. We took the subway with our bees to Queens, and we installed them. Pretty simple. Most honeybees are surprisingly docile unless aggravated. On the left, there's a picture of the bees in the summer. They're bearding. They do that because it's quite hot on the roof, around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Not sure what that is in Celsius, but the rooftop gets a lot of direct sunlight, so it heats up quite easily. These are our Langstroth hives, which vertically stack as the bee colony expands. On the right, we hosted some of our friends from Woodbine to keep another hive with us as well. They have a top bar hive that they built, which is more of a natural style of hive. So here's a plug for beekeeping. Keep bees and grow plants with friends. Our pepper transplants. So these peppers were transplanted onto this roof as well. It can be hard to apply permaculture techniques in an urban context, but the urban context forces more resourcefulness. I believe that container gardening and modularity is a big aspect of the logic of urban living. We can container garden with perennials. Fruit trees can take years to grow, and these can follow you around from apartment to apartment if necessary, or be parked at a community garden, such as El Garden or Princess Inn Garden, or on a friend's rooftop. From a different angle, here's the full picture of the super hot pepper grow and beekeeping operation. For the most part, urban ag, as mentioned before, isn't a silver bullet. We won't be getting most of our calories from city-grown cultivation anytime soon. But specialty crops can be viable. The most difficult part is probably logistics. There's a reason why permaculture homesteads are designed from zones 0 to 5. Proximity to housing matters a lot. A fruitful avenue to explore may be co-locating small gardens with offices. Housing is a separate but related issue to land. I'm honestly surprised so few startups are seriously building corporate dormitories. This article from Wall Street Journal showcases one of those boring dystopian moments. Everyone messes around with their food choice, but not as many are exploring alternative experiments in housing. If rents around trusts, for example, rapidly outpace salaries, it would make it very difficult for trusts to become an enduring institution. There's a variety of areas that we need to experiment with regards to alternative housing. Digital nomadism is a frontier. I would like to see cooperatives that make van dwells. It's easy to take pot shots at the digital nomads and the seasetters, just as it's easy to take pot shots at Silicon Valley. But at the frontiers, we do get glimpses of the future, even if the politics or approach are naive. When it comes to seasteading outside of the libertarian ideology, not sure about other areas, but houseboats have had a long culture in the Bay Area. On the left is a Prius camp set up by one of the BFX members. Interestingly, this Prius also has the open source Comma AI kit for level 2 vehicle autonomy. This is what I have been calling the quote unquote self-driving living room. On the right is an article, car sharing service operator Oryx Auto Corp couldn't figure out what certain customers were doing with its rentals cars. It realized in 2018 that some people who rented vehicles never actually drove them. Oryx examined its mileage records after it was asked about the issue by media outlets and found several percent of its rented vehicles traveled no distance. I know in high school for myself, I slept pretty much every lunch period when I had a car senior year, so it makes sense to me. I'm sure there are many interesting spaces across the world, and admittedly, I don't believe that I'm well traveled. But one of the intriguing spaces in New York that I found is Woodbine. Woodbine is an experimental hub in Ridgewood, Queens, for developing the skills, practices, and tools needed to build autonomy. They host reading groups, a weekly dinner. Interestingly, the history of Woodbine, a group of friends moved to Ridgewood, a middle-income residential neighborhood on the border of Brooklyn and Queens. They have a small space, again, where they host dinners. One of the members started a coffee shop / bookstore around the corner. Some of their members run a free healthcare clinic. They've helped revitalize the Ridgewood Community Garden. They host a CSA every season. A couple of their members now have moved to Hudson Valley, actually near where Kia and some other friends spent this past New Year's. But I think this original hub and spoke model of a community moving to the same neighborhood with a shared communal space, it reminds me a lot of the idea of permaculture zones, but in an urban context. In general, I think there's a lot to explore here. We've mostly discussed infrastructural provisions of culture today, but I'd be remiss to ignore the ideological. I won't belabor the point, as much work has been made of culture and how to make it, but the modern human experience, as we know, is primarily revolves around cultural transmission. Morton makes a strong case for appreciating art and tapping into the ineffable interconnectedness as being a key to ecological awareness. All these aspects are no doubt central to creating a permanent culture. And these aesthetic hooks, they create rallying points. There's no doubt that aesthetics, ideologies, they affect our behavior and cultural affinities and help us craft rituals. To some of Toby's work again, these aesthetic signals also offer strong proof of work to signal in versus out groups. Interestingly, the more distinctive these can be, the more powerful. For example, if these signals get latched onto by out group, the othering process can itself lead to a strong reflexive loop. I don't need constant affirmation of self-identification necessarily if someone else is telling me that I'm different. I don't know if any of you were scene kids, but take notes. Experiment with hairstyles, tattoos, styles of dress, make patches, applique your shit, make beats, make mixtapes, start a screamo band. But in this day and age, we can't talk about material provisions without money. We can't pay for our ever-increasing costs of healthcare, housing, or experiments. These cultures need a provision for themselves, and building those capacities to address those needs is part of this provisioning. But it's very difficult to address all these needs in isolation. Cultures need to coexist lest they be vulnerable to socioeconomic forces. In my experience, community organizers often gravitate towards the most disadvantaged communities, and there's a default for their work output to be free. It's extremely important to stress that as we are in this for the long haul, a permanent culture, financial sustainability needs to be met for community organizers and the community at large. In many cases, this may mean working within communities that have surpluses, at least to start. There are 4 main strategies I suggest cultures use to experiment with money. 1, leverage cultural brandedness. 2, generate new value by tapping into ecology and circular economies. 3, aggregate purchasing power. 4, create new money. The above activities, if done thoughtfully, will end up helping accumulate resources. Brandedness, I think, is self-explanatory. Allow supporters to engage with your culture. This also goes to the point of having both active/passive modes of engagement. We can't expect people to be all in or all out. This is increasingly important in the way culture is distributed. Music, images, memes, videos, fashions, ideologies are all equally part of modern culture and will be integral to the success of any permanent culture. Circular economies. If you're a company, really understand your supply chain and waste streams. Having worked on a variety of supply chain projects over the years, reverse logistics is something rarely considered. Unfortunately, planned obsolescence itself is also basically a given now as consumers. So tap into waste streams. A good example of tapping into potential waste stream is mushroom cultivation. Mushrooms can grow off of spent sawdust, coffee grounds, cardboard, etc. Waste streams are powerful. I was once struck by a leashless tweet about how one could live off of technology from a previous decade for essentially free. It's profound to think about the cycle of technology deployment and how much discarded technology exists. Aggregate purchasing power. On the left is a picture of a half grass-fed steer from a Hudson Valley farmer that uses regenerative practice. This is way cheaper than buying from a grocery store. On the right is biosphere X kimchi production. Better than aggregating purchasing power. Aggregate purchase power and also do value-add processing as a culture. Other possibilities for aggregating purchasing power, sharing housing as discussed previously, sharing vehicles. There's a lot. Experiment with new monies. This is something that I believe has been lost over the years, but old school local currencies, I think, unlocked a lot of power. And it's something I'm currently thinking a lot about. In the background is a selection of local currencies from around the world, from Catalonia, Spain, Canada, Kenya, Baltimore, South Africa, and this headline from Bloomberg. Italian officials don't know how lira gets exchanged to euro since it's no longer legal tender. But just putting the local currency cap on, could they just be using this as a local currency? Cryptocurrencies are, of course, another example of monetary experiments. It's increasingly clear to me that the cryptocurrency industry has a lot to learn about the currency aspect, but there's no doubt that Bitcoin and a vast associated movement of cryptocurrencies is doing great work in experimenting with new monies. Shout out to Circle's UBI. Startups, perhaps underappreciated as a monetary experiment, but startup equity is a currency that has been showing significant value accretion recently. I suggest we all consider starting companies if we are considering monetary praxis. In summary, in coordinating lean startup style cultural experiments, communities should be accumulating resources and distributing it among its population, as well as allocating resources to its commons. The bootstrapping culture like this means running experiments in the autonomous provisioning of material needs, and we need to allocate resources that we have gathered. Finally, I don't say this lightly, but to create a culture is to understand that there's a responsibility for protecting it. Violence and conflict are the elephants in the room. One important aspect of our past decades has been its relative stability. Globalism and peace, when this equilibrium challenged, will lead to new orders emerging. When our environment begins to shift, the food chain does with it. Conflict can come in many forms. It can be physical, of course, but it can also be economic, political, legal, social. To create permanent cultures is to know how to bite back. Teamwork, physical culture, bodily autonomy, food, diet, housing, aesthetics, ideology, money. That ends the section of bootstrapping a permanent culture using this framework of applying lean experiments to autonomous provisioning of a community's needs. These last slides are a couple ideas just on what it means to grow a permanent culture beyond the bootstrapping stages. As a permanent culture grows, ecological awareness becomes ingrained into its very core. The permanent culture will develop strong capabilities in certain of those 6 areas and continue to grow to span a wide range of experience. Experiments in these areas will cultivate small practices into meaningful capacities. If you've done significant community organizing, I hope the idea of applying adaptability from lean startup with principles from permaculture can inspire some concrete steps. For those that haven't, I hope this serves as an entry point for thinking about building autonomous capacities. It can be daunting, but the journey is worthwhile. So there are 2 main strategies that one can see about what it means to potentially grow a culture. Taking from biology, our selected species are high growth and low investment, basically. K-selected species are low growth, high investment. We may start off as startup bros, but as we grow as a culture, by nature of the limited pool of startup bros, the diversity of the population increases. And as it grows, it becomes more and more important for those roles to have active and passive ways of engaging. Simon Wardley, strategist mentioned before, has a technique he uses for mapping out business dynamics. We can take a cue from his business mapping process, which itself takes inspiration from the development of a town. As the cultural life cycle matures, it's not only that the population diversifies, different roles emerge and are necessary as the types of activities change. What this also means is that knowledge capital needs to be produced within these activities, and a culture needs to adapt to shifts in hierarchies. This isn't really how one reads a Wardley map, but another way to say it is that as a culture develops, it needs to form institutions, represented here by product, and even further platforms, represented here by commodity. To create a culture that spans millennia is a substantial undertaking, but it's striving for these kind of enduring cultures that will make a difference. For it's only through rethinking the relationship with ecology, technology, markets, and sociality that we can address the problems imminent to our times. In closing, what's the connection between civilization and culture? When we briefly discussed Spengler earlier, we mentioned this idea of the relationship of a civilization being a culture that ossifies and slowly crumbles. Given information and cultural fluidity in today's age, I believe that we must take more liberties with our definition of culture, and that the end result is that cultural determinism is falsely placed. But still, Spengler has a point. In our quest to build permanent cultures, we must seek to continue to adapt and evolve over thousands of years. We will see permanent cultures spawn the rise and fall of social movements, but those social movements will not define the permanent culture. Rather, the permanent culture contains them. To address the problem of nowadays, permanent cultures must contain multitudes. Thanks. Together, let's do crazy shit, live on the fringe, cultivate utopia, have a few drinks, but take the next step. Culture awaits.